Thank you all. Amen. Well, before I started preaching this morning, I had a couple of brief things I wanted to share with you. One is I found out at this last Wednesday night's United Methodist Men's Soup Supper, they were collecting a love offering at the soup supper for our Matthew 25 fund. And you all who came to the soup supper gave $960 to the Matthew 25 fund. Awesome. Very nice. That's a big help to those in need in our community. We have people who come in every week and people who have needs that might look to us like they're not really that big, but I had one lady come in not too long ago. All she needed was $57. But if she didn't get that $57, they were going to shut off her electricity. And it was going to cost her a great deal more than that to get it turned back on. And we were able to help and able to prevent that from happening. And that's because of your generosity. The other thing I wanted to do is to mention that this week has been the celebration of Veterans Day. And so I wanted to take an opportunity to recognize any veterans we have with us. If you're a veteran of one of our armed services, would you please stand up? Any veterans here? All right. Thank you. Thank you. And on behalf of First United Methodist Church, thank you for your service to our country. We appreciate all that you have given and done. Well, today as I read the scriptures, I'm actually reading about someone who did something for her community of faith that she maybe didn't think was particularly important, but turned out to be really important in the long run. I actually didn't get this to the video people, but I changed the title of my sermon over the weekend, and so I'll tell you what it is that I'm doing with that as we get there. But I'm in Mark chapter 12, beginning at verse 38. As he taught, this is Jesus talking, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplace, and have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance, say long prayers. They will receive greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, the poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury, for all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, as I read the passage, there's lots of things you can get out of this text. You can talk specifically about giving in the text. There are just lots of things you can do with this text. In fact, most passages of Scripture, you can find multiple sermons to preach out of. Otherwise, at some time, preaching would cease, right? Don't get any ideas. And so there's plenty of things to get out of this text. But one of the things that I got out of this text was the importance of the small things that we do. Now, Jesus starts off by saying, we don't want to be the kind of people who do stuff just to be seen. And in fact, it's my understanding that the box that was used for giving to the synagogue treasury actually had kind of a funnel-like device on the top, which so that when you put your coins in, it went right in like it's supposed to, because they didn't have paper money then, they just had coins. And if you've ever been to Israel, I was there about 4 years ago or so with our bishop, they sell, the vendors all sell these little coins that they call widow's mites, which are supposed to be replicas of the kind of coin that was used. That's not their normal currency anymore, but it's a very small coin. It's probably maybe just slightly larger than a dime, quite a bit less than a quarter. Not a lot there. It's just a copper coin, not worth very much. But you put your money in this and it would slide down into the opening. I don't know how many of you have ever seen these coin collector games that they have at malls as a way to get kids to throw away your money. The way it works is they see this kind of funnel thing, and the kid gets a quarter, a penny, a dime, whatever you can part with, and then they'll put it in there and it spins around and around and around. And of course then at the bottom it drops in a hole and you don't get it back. Pretty ingenious when you think about it, a way to just stick something in the mall and get people just to give you their money. But apparently, some people in Jesus' day who would put a fair number of coins in the treasury had learned how to kind of take those coins and almost spin them so that they would take a longer amount of time going down into the hole, and you got more of a sense of how much they gave. It was showing off, in other words. It was a way of showing off. And then this widow comes and put these 2 coins in, which wouldn't seem like they would make much of a difference. I mean, she had no illusions that this was going to make budget for the church by her dropping those 2 coins in, that this was going to, make some huge difference, but it's what she had to give. And that got me thinking about small things that we do which are actually extremely important things in the church. And things that maybe aren't small but aren't always seen. Some people have upfront jobs like I do, where I'm standing in front of you all the time, or our praise bands are standing or up here in front of you pretty often, and so you see what they're doing. But there are a huge number of things that happen in this church that you either don't see, or you're just so used to it happening you don't notice who's doing it. For example, up in the balcony, we have our sound and video technicians up here. Can you give them a round of applause? Yeah. We largely forget they're there, except when my mic quits working for some bizarre reason, or the computer decides to reboot itself and the screen stopped working or something. You only notice when something's not there, right? And yet it would be pretty difficult for me to do this service without their help. I actually did one funeral a number of months ago where we had a major problem with the sound system, and I did part of the funeral without a microphone. I stood in the center aisle, and let me tell you, I could lose my voice pretty quickly without a sound system in this room. We have people who are doing other things behind the scenes that you know that they're doing, like our ushers and greeters who are back there and making sure people get bulletins and making sure people find a seat, or if they've got a question about where the nursery is or this part of the building or that, they're back there doing that. Can you give them a round of applause? And while they won't hear us, we have our children's workers who are back in the nursery, teachers who are teaching kids in Sunday school. We have people who are back in hospitality, seeing the people get a cup of coffee, which we all know, at least I've been told, is the third sacrament of the Methodist Church, coffee. All those people are doing things. How about another round of applause? Now, I'll be honest with you, I could do this for 20 minutes. I could stand up here and name all the people who do small and great things in this church, much of which is behind the scenes that you would only notice if it stopped happening. From the staff printing the bulletins to people who work for the church visiting shut-ins, and then people who just volunteer their time. It's fairly common for me to show up at the hospital or a care facility and find that one of you is there or has been there already. You've gone to visit a friend, somebody you care about. You beat me there because that's something you do. So, what the tendency is then, though, is to think that the less visible jobs aren't important. And yet most of the visible jobs, visible activities in the church would grind to an absolute halt if it wasn't for all the people doing all the smaller things around us. And maybe you're one of those people who does things kind of in the background, and you might think that what you do isn't important. But it's extremely important, because it's all the small little things that people do that make for a welcoming, loving, caring church. I don't know how often you all visit a church when you go on vacation or out of town with family, but it's really strange when you're a guest at a church that you're not familiar with, and you step into the sanctuary and you're kind of looking around for a seat and you don't know where to sit. And everybody's got their favorite seats in church. I grew up sitting about where Jim's sitting, actually, in my church, right about there. That's about my family's seat row there. This side of the sanctuary, why? I don't know. That's the one. About so many pews back. That's where I use. So you go into a church you're not from, and you go and you try to find a spot, and then you're afraid you're going to take somebody's spot, right? And then how do you know whether you're comfortable or not? Well, largely it's because if somebody in that area where you're trying to look for a spot to sit, if somebody smiles at you, gives you a friendly greeting, maybe reaches out a hand, says something like, "Oh, would you sit here with us?" Wow, that can make all the difference in the world right there to how you feel about your experience of church that morning. Or if you get the opposite, "This is my pew, kid. Why don't you sit up here?" Well, then you get a different sense of what people are doing. You may be doing so many small things that make people feel welcome or important or needed, maybe because you have a listening ear and you listen to people when they've got problems, or maybe you're a person who prays for or with other people. But it's those little things that are extremely important. Excuse me. I'm allergic to Iowa in the fall. So I take allergy meds, and it does the job, but it makes me thirsty. So I don't know if I've told you this story or not before. I need to start marking these because, when you got 30 years of ministry stories, pretty soon, if you're not careful, you start telling the same ones again. So bear with me if I've told you this story before, and I'll try to remember not to tell it again here. My family is from the St. Louis area originally, and we started out in one part of the city, and I grew up in a small little church, same church until I guess I was about 15, and then we moved across town to another part of the city, and it would have meant that it was at least probably half an hour drive to the previous church we used to go to. So my folks decided it was time to look for a church closer to where we were now living. And we started visiting around, and we went into one church, and it was a congregation about this size. And we wandered in and, of course, tried to find a place to sit, kind of look around uncomfortably, trying to figure out where you ought to be. And as we were getting our seats, a young high school student came up to us. He was probably a junior or a senior at that time, but he was a high school student. Name is Bart. Bart came up to my brother and I, who were about to slide into the pew with my parents, and said, "Hey, the youth usually sit over here. We kind of like to sit together. Would you guys want to come sit with us?" My brother and I looked at our parents like, "Is this cool?" And they're like, "Yeah, sure." So we got up and we sat with the high school youth that day. Then following worship, some of the youth said, "Hey, we have Sunday school during the next service time. Would you want to come to the youth Sunday school with us?" And we went to Sunday school, and don't know for sure what my parents did, but I think they may have gone to an adult Sunday school class that morning. Now, this gentleman, Bart, his name is Bart Hildreth, is now the Reverend Bart Hildreth. He's the pastor of the First United Methodist Church of St. Charles, Missouri now. And Bart's still a good friend of mine, and he does not remember this happening. I'll tell you why he doesn't remember it. It's a little thing. It was a small thing. He was just being himself. He's an outgoing, inviting kind of person, and he just asked my brother and I to sit with his friends. A really small thing. But after that Sunday, my parents decided that's where we were going to church. Why? Because they felt like my brother and I had found a place to connect to a youth group, and they thought, for them at that time, that was one of the more important things about church, was finding a place where my brother and I in high school were going to fit in. Now, that church became very important to me. That was the church where I was called to preach. That was the church I preached my very first sermon in when I was 17 years old. It was supposed to be a 20-minute sermon. I think it was 11 and a half minutes or 10 and a half minutes or something like that, because I was nervous and I just kept talking faster and faster and faster. But if not for the small thing that my friend Bart did that day, I don't know. I mean, I hung out in that youth group the whole time through high school. We traveled together. We went on retreats together. I went to Sunday school there. I learned about my faith there. I grew in that church. Would I have grown in my faith someplace else? Maybe, probably. But it wouldn't have been there, would it? All because somebody did a small thing. They just decided to be inviting. So you are probably already doing things like that all the time and you just don't realize it. You run into somebody in the hallway and you give them a nice friendly smile and you don't know what a difference that makes in their day. Or you have a person stop you and they tell you about a difficulty they're having in their life this week, and you just stand there and listen, and it doesn't seem like a lot, but at that moment it's extremely important to them that somebody listens to them and heard them out. All those little things we do make a huge difference. It's not often the big showy things that ultimately matter. That's because the church, when it's at its best, is a welcoming family where people feel they belong. Years ago, people came into the church first by believing, okay? They believed something about the faith, and maybe they were specifically United Methodist, and they drove by a church and they saw the cross and flame out there and said, well, I'm a Methodist, let's go there. They believed, and then they belonged. What we understand now about adults today is adults are struggling with what they believe. Doesn't mean they're not Christian or they don't believe in God, but they might be struggling with what they believe. So what they're looking for first in a fellowship of believers is it a place I'm comfortable being? When they go into a church, they're not specifically looking to hear that they always agree with everything the pastor says. By the way, if you always 100% agree with me, you and I need to talk because something's not right there. My wife doesn't even agree with all my sermons. I mean, they may not believe everything exactly like you and I believe. And frankly, where there are two Methodists, there's at least three opinions, so you can get all kinds of things like that. Or they may not have grown up in our tradition. They may have grown up in a different faith tradition entirely. But what causes people to be part of a fellowship of believers now is somehow they start to feel like they belong. That when they walk in, they're going to meet friendly faces and open discussion and a friendly hand that reaches out to them. That they're going to feel like they have a place where they're a part of what's going on. Now, all that's so small. Now, if you're not a person who automatically does this, let me tell you some ways you can do these little things that are really powerful for people. When you're out in maybe our Hebrews Cafe, or you're out in the hallway and you see somebody you don't know, stop them and say, my name is, I don't think I know you. Now, you may find out they're already a member of the church. We have 3 church services, or maybe they even sit on the opposite side of the sanctuary than you do, because, people, I don't know if you know this or not, people almost never switch sides of the sanctuary. They might switch pews, but heaven forbid we switch sides of the sanctuary, right? My parents and I tried it once, and we didn't like it. We always ended up on the same side. But you may not know them, and they may already be a member of the church, but if you find that out, there's nothing wrong with that. It just means there's another member of this congregation whose name you now know, and they now know yours. And if they're a guest, well, wow, you get to say, oh, wow, I'm a member of the church here. I'm so glad you're a guest with us today. Is there anything I could help you find? Have you had a cup of coffee? Would you like to visit? Oh, you're looking for the sanctuary. Well, it's this way, Those are small things. But when you're a new person and you're trying to figure out if this is the place you fit in, it's the small little things that make all the difference. Now, I think about this widow giving what she had. Now, I bet Jesus wasn't the only one who could have noticed that she probably didn't have a lot to give. But she was being an incredible example of generosity in what she did. And as a wise woman, she herself may have realized that by doing what she could, she was being an example to other people. She was being an example to other people. Whether that's in giving or sharing or being with other people, we learn from what other people do. Some of you all know that I grew up in a denomination where you actually most of the time baptize people by dunking them, immersion baptism. And United Methodists do that too. I've done that in the last year. But the very first time I ever did an immersion baptism, I realized I was about to have a baptism for a young person, and I've never done it before. Now, you would think if you grow up in a denomination that does baptism that way all the time, they'd teach you how to do that. No, it's assumed. So I called up a pastor friend of mine who I'd worked for as his associate, and I said, Charles, how do I do this? And he gave me simple, careful instructions on how to perform a baptism in that way. And probably for a lot of years when I did that kind of baptism, I did it exactly the way that he told me how to do that. It wasn't hard, wasn't complicated, but his way of doing it became an example for how I at least started to do something in my ministry. You may be an example of joyfulness or friendliness. You may be an example of leadership to other people just simply by doing what you do every day. And somebody is kind of taking mental notes. Oh, I like the way they do that. I like the way they visit with people. I like the way they're so outgoing and friendly with people. And you may be affecting way more people than you know simply by being who you are. To me, that's one of the gifts of the gospel, is God takes us for what we are and who we are and uses those gifts. So while there are some upfront kind of jobs that we do in the church, those are actually not the most important ones. What you all are doing every day to make people feel that they belong here is the most important thing we can do. Because people out in this world need friends. People out in this world need people who care about them. People out in the world often don't have a place they belong. Let's help them feel that they belong here by every little thing we do. Let us pray. Lord Jesus, I thank you for my friend who doesn't even remember doing a small thing, and yet it affected the rest of my life as a Christian. Help us, Lord, to remember to keep doing those small acts of love and kindness in other people's lives. Help us to remember that when we do something small, others may be watching and seeing the love and the friendliness that we give to someone we don't know and learning from that. Help us to be examples of Christian love in this world, Lord, so that anyone who comes in here can find a place of belonging, of care, of love, of concern. In Christ's name, amen.